13,000 years ago, one culture touched almost every corner of North America. Then, in the span of a single human lifetime, it was gone. Not a slow fade, not a gradual decline. Somewhere around 300 years after it began, the most successful society the continent had ever seen simply stops showing up in the ground. No war, no obvious disaster written into the rock, just silence. And nearly a century after we found the first evidence of these people, scientists still can't agree on what happened to them. By the end of this video, you'll understand the three leading suspects behind one of the oldest cold cases in human history, and why, as recently as this year, the entire timeline researchers thought they'd solved got thrown back into question. We call this culture Clovis, and that name is almost an accident. It comes from a small town in eastern New Mexico, not from anything the people who lived there called themselves, because we don't know what they called themselves. What we do know is built entirely from what they left behind. A spear point, unlike anything found before it, fluted at the base, sharp enough and well-engineered enough to bring down the largest animals that ever walked the continent. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths taller than a grown man. For archaeologists, that point became a signature, and wherever it turned up fast, across a landscape bigger than most modern countries, in a window of time so short it barely registers on a geological scale. The story of how we found them starts with a teenager. In February of 1929, a 19-year-old named Ridgely Whiteman was walking a dry gully outside his hometown when he noticed something that shouldn't have been there: stone points lying next to mammoth bone. He wrote to the Smithsonian Institution more than once, describing what he'd found. For a while, almost nobody listened. It took highway crews digging gravel out of that same ground in 1932 to finally expose enough bone that professional archaeologists couldn't ignore it any longer. What they found, once they started digging properly, would rewrite what anyone thought they knew about how long humans had been on this continent. That site, Blackwater Draw, became what's known as a type site, the place that defines the whole culture. And what they pulled out of it wasn't just proof that people had hunted mammoths. It was proof that an entire way of life had once stretched across an entire continent, then disappeared almost overnight. Here's where the story stops being a discovery and starts being a mystery. Because when researchers finally nailed down the dates using modern carbon methods, the numbers were almost unbelievable. Clovis technology appears roughly 13,050 years ago. It vanishes from the record about 12,750 years ago. That's a run of around 300 years, 3 centuries, and then nothing. No slow tapering off across 1,000 years the way most ancient cultures fade, an abrupt stop, and that stop lines up almost to the year with 2 other catastrophes: the extinction of the last of North America's giant Ice Age animals, and the beginning of a sudden, brutal cold snap called the Younger Dryas. 3 endings, 1 moment in time. And for the last 50 years, 3 groups of scientists have been arguing about which one caused the other 2. The first suspect is the simplest, and in some ways the most uncomfortable: us. In the 1970s, a paleontologist named Paul Martin proposed something he called the overkill hypothesis. The idea that Clovis hunters, using their new fluted spear points, hunted mammoths and mastodons into extinction so efficiently that they collapsed the entire ecosystem those animals were part of. It's not a fringe idea. Some of the timing genuinely supports it. In parts of the United States, the wave of megafaunal extinction lines up closely with the very first solid evidence of human presence in the area. It's a clean, brutal story. Humans arrive, humans hunt too well, and the animals that fed them, and the world they lived in, collapse underneath them. But if you thought that was the end of it, it's only going to get more complicated from here. Because critics of the overkill theory point out something that should bother anyone hearing this story for the first time. Run the math on how much energy it actually takes to hunt a mammoth, the risk, the group coordination, the sheer physical toll, against how many calories you get back from the kill, and some researchers have found the numbers don't clearly favor humans as the driving force. And there's a deeper problem underneath that one. Was the Clovis population, spread thin across a continent, ever actually large enough to hunt dozens of large mammal species into oblivion in just a few centuries? Some scientists looking at the same data have concluded something almost opposite to the overkill theory, that it was climate change, not population growth, that best explains the pattern of extinction. Same evidence, completely different verdict. Which brings us to suspect number 2, and it's not a hunter with a spear, it's the ocean itself. As the last ice age ended, an immense glacial lake called Lake Agassiz sat trapped behind a wall of retreating ice, holding back an amount of fresh water almost too large to picture. The leading scientific explanation for what happened next is that this ice dam failed catastrophically, sending that fresh water pouring into the North Atlantic. That single event, researchers argue, was enough to shut down the ocean circulation system that had been keeping the region relatively warm, and the northern hemisphere plunged back into near glacial conditions for more than 1,000 years. This is the mainstream explanation. No comet required, no mass slaughter required, just plain physics, a broken dam, and an ocean current that stopped moving heat around the planet the way it always had. Under this kind of collapse, both the animals Clovis depended on and the people themselves would have been squeezed by a landscape that was rapidly turning hostile. Grasslands drying up, migration routes disappearing, a way of life built entirely around abundance suddenly starved of it. Even that explanation isn't as settled as it sounds, though. Scientists studying the ocean floor are still publishing new models about exactly how that freshwater shutdown actually worked. Some now argue it happened in 2 separate phases, not one clean break. The consensus theory keeps getting rewritten even as it stays the consensus. And that instability in the science is exactly what opened the door for the third and by far the most explosive suspect. In 2007, a team of scientists dropped a bombshell onto a room full of geologists in Acapulco, Mexico. Their claim? That the Younger Dryas wasn't just a climate accident, it was triggered by a comet. Specifically, they proposed that one or more fragments of a comet exploded over North America roughly 12,800 years ago, either slamming into the edge of the massive ice sheet covering Canada or detonating above it in a series of airbursts. The team, which called itself the Comet Research Group, pointed to strange evidence buried in the sediment layer from that exact moment in time. Microscopic diamonds that typically only form under extreme pressure, tiny spherules of melted glass, shocked quartz grains, a spike in a rare element called platinum. One of the lead researchers, an oceanographer named James Kennett, put it bluntly, describing the aftermath as continent-wide wildfires so severe that, in his words, the entire continent was on fire. Under this theory, it wasn't slow climate change and it wasn't overhunting. It was a single, catastrophic afternoon that ended the Clovis world almost overnight, which would finally explain why the archaeological record doesn't show a slow decline, but a hard stop. It's a genuinely thrilling theory. It's also one of the most fought-over ideas in modern archaeology. Some of the same evidence the Comet Research Group presented as proof of an impact has been challenged, re-examined, and, in at least one major case, retracted entirely. A 2025 paper claiming to have found shocked quartz supporting the impact theory was pulled from the scientific record in February of this year after outside experts found serious problems with how the samples were dated. One veteran Clovis-era researcher, who spent decades skeptical of the comet idea, ultimately admitted something telling, that something major clearly happened at the end of the Clovis era that science still hasn't fully explained. He just wasn't convinced it was a comet. That tension, real scientists on both sides, neither one able to fully close the case, is exactly where this mystery has sat for almost 20 years. And just when you think the story can't get any stranger, here's the twist that changes what disappeared even means. In 2014, a team of geneticists sequenced the genome of a 1 to 2-year-old boy buried in Montana more than 12,000 years ago, surrounded by more than 100 stone and bone tools, the only human being ever found buried directly with Clovis grave goods. Researchers named him Anzac 1, and what his DNA revealed didn't just answer a question about Clovis, it rewrote the entire premise of this story. Anzac 1 wasn't a genetic dead end. His ancestry connects directly to indigenous populations living across North and South America today, which means the Clovis people didn't vanish, not in the way we usually mean that word. Their toolkit disappeared, their specific way of life disappeared, but the people themselves, or at least many of them, didn't go extinct. They adapted, split into dozens of new regional cultures, and became the ancestors of millions of people alive right now. The mystery was never really where did they go, it was why did they stop being Clovis? And that's a very different and, in some ways, even harder question to answer. If you thought the story was finally settling down after that, brace yourself, because the ground under this entire mystery shifted again this year. For decades, one archaeological site more than any other had been treated as sacred proof in this debate. Monte Verde, a swampy site in southern Chile that appeared to show people living there 14,500 years ago, more than 1,000 years before Clovis even existed. When a panel of skeptical archaeologists finally accepted those dates back in 1997, it was treated as one of the great paradigm shifts in the field. Proof that Clovis wasn't first, that something older and stranger came before it. It became the bedrock everyone else built on. Then, in March of this year, a team led by a self-described pre-Clovis skeptic published something that cracked that bedrock wide open. Using new geological sampling along the creek that runs past the original dig site, they argued that the deposits long thought to prove humans lived there 14,000 years ago were actually far younger, as young as 4,200 years old, with ancient woods simply washing downstream and getting mixed into much more recent sediment, making the site look thousands of years older than it really is. If they're right, one of the most important sites in the entire first American story might not be pre-Clovis at all. Unsurprisingly, that didn't go over quietly. The original excavation team fired back almost immediately, publishing a formal rebuttal challenging the new sampling methods. One archaeologist watching from the sidelines predicted exactly what was coming, that this was going to cause a furor in the field, and that there was going to be a fight. As of right now, that fight is still going on out in the open in peer-reviewed journals with no resolution in sight. So, where does that leave us? A culture that rose faster than almost any other in prehistory and vanished just as fast. 3 competing explanations. A hunt gone catastrophically well, a climate collapse triggered by a broken glacial dam, and a comet that may or may not have actually struck the Earth. None of them fully proven, none of them fully disproven. A genetic twist that quietly rewrote the ending, revealing that the people themselves likely never disappeared at all. And a scientific debate about the very foundation of this story that is, right now in this calendar year, still being argued in real time by the people who've spent their careers trying to solve it. Maybe that's the real reason this story has stuck around for almost a century. It isn't really about spear points or comets or an ancient lake breaking its banks. It's about how fragile even a wildly successful way of life can be, and how easily something that once covered an entire continent can slip through the cracks of history, leaving behind nothing but a handful of stone tools and a question we still can't fully answer. If there's one thing this case proves, it's that the story of the first Americans isn't a settled chapter in a textbook. It's an open file, still being investigated, still capable of surprising the very people studying it. And somewhere out there, in a gravel pit or creek bed nobody's looked at closely yet, The next piece of this puzzle is probably still waiting to be found.